A soldier can bleed to death from a severed femoral artery in approximately 3 minutes. Standard Army field dressings applied with perfect technique might extend that to 4 minutes, if the medic is lucky. By the time a wounded man reaches a battalion aid station, he is already dead. But on the morning of October 14, 1943, near the Volturno River in Italy, a 22-year-old medic named John Shafrath watched 4 men die in front of him in less than 20 minutes. All 4 had arterial wounds. All 4 received textbook treatment. All 4 bled out before they could be evacuated. Shafrath had been a medic for 11 months. He had treated gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, fractures, and amputations. He knew how to apply tourniquets, pack wounds, administer morphine, and stabilize shock. He had done everything by the book, and he had watched 37 men bleed to death anyway. The problem was simple. Standard field dressings could not create enough pressure fast enough to stop arterial bleeding. The gauze absorbed blood, but did not compress the wound. By the time a medic tied the bandage tight enough to slow the hemorrhage, the soldier had already lost too much blood. His heart rate climbed. His blood pressure dropped. His skin turned pale and cold. Then he went into shock. Then he died. Shafrath knew there had to be a better way. He just did not know what it was yet. But after watching those 4 men die on October 14th, something inside him changed. He stopped accepting that arterial wounds meant death. He started believing he could fix this problem, and he was right. Within 6 weeks, Shafrath would modify the standard field dressing using materials that cost less than 50 cents. His modification would stop arterial bleeding in 8 seconds. It would save 4 men in its first combat application. And over the next 18 months, it would save more than 200 soldiers who should have died. But first, he had to figure out what was wrong with the bandages everyone had been using since 1917. Private First Class John William Shafrath was 22 years old, from Terre Haute, Indiana, where he had worked as a pharmacy assistant before the war. He had been treating wounded soldiers as a combat medic with the 45th Infantry Division for 11 months in North Africa and Italy. Shafrath was methodical, quiet, and obsessively focused on details. Before the war, he had spent 3 years learning pharmaceutical procedures, measuring precise dosages, and understanding how medications worked in the human body. He brought that same precision to battlefield medicine. Shafrath had joined the Army in December 1941, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. He was 19 years old. He had no intention of becoming a medic. He wanted to be an infantryman. But during basic training at Camp Livingston in Louisiana, an officer noticed that Shafrath could remain calm under pressure, follow complex instructions without error, and did not panic when other men were screaming. The officer recommended him for medical training. Shafrath reported to the Army Medical Training Center at Camp Barkley in Texas in March 1942. Medical training lasted 16 weeks. Shafrath learned anatomy, physiology, wound treatment, disease prevention, and emergency surgery assistance. He learned how to apply tourniquets, splint fractures, treat burns, and recognize shock. He learned that speed mattered more than perfection. He learned that soldiers died from blood loss faster than anything else. And he learned that the standard Army field dressing was a rectangular gauze pad attached to a cloth bandage. The medic placed the pad over the wound and wrapped the bandage around the limb. That was the procedure. That was what everyone did. That was what had been done since the First World War. Shafrath deployed to North Africa in June 1943. The 45th Division landed at Scogliti, Sicily, in July as part of Operation Husky. Shafrath treated his first combat casualty on July 10, 1943. A corporal from Baker Company had been hit by shrapnel from a German artillery shell. The shrapnel had severed the brachial artery in his left arm. Shafrath applied a tourniquet above the wound, placed a field dressing over the injury, and wrapped the bandage as tightly as he could. The corporal died 4 minutes later from blood loss. Shafrath had done everything correctly. It did not matter. That was the beginning. Over the next 4 months in Sicily and Italy, Shafrath would treat 218 wounded soldiers. 37 of them would die from arterial bleeding before they could reach a battalion aid station. Shafrath kept a small notebook in his medical bag. He recorded every death: name, rank, date, type of wound, time from injury to treatment, time from treatment to death. He was looking for a pattern. He was looking for something he could fix. By October 1943, Shafrath had identified the problem. Standard field dressings did not compress wounds effectively. The gauze pad absorbed blood, but did not create enough pressure to collapse the artery. The cloth bandage stretched when tied, reducing compression, and the whole process took too long. By the time a medic applied the dressing, wrapped the bandage, and tied it off, the soldier had already lost a pint of blood, maybe more. That was often enough to cause irreversible shock. Shafrath needed a dressing that worked faster, compressed harder, and stopped bleeding immediately. He needed something that could be applied in seconds instead of minutes, and he needed to build it himself, because nobody else seemed to think this was a problem worth solving. The standard Army field dressing had not changed significantly since 1917. It consisted of a 4-inch square gauze pad attached to a muslin bandage approximately 2 inches wide and 6 feet long. The gauze pad was attached to the middle of the bandage. When a medic applied the dressing, he placed the pad directly over the wound and wrapped the bandage around the limb or torso, securing it with a knot or metal clips. The dressing was designed to be universal. It could be applied to almost any wound on any part of the body. That versatility made it standard issue for every soldier in the Army. But versatility came with limitations. The gauze pad absorbed blood, but did not compress the wound effectively. The muslin bandage stretched when wet with blood, reducing pressure. And the application process required multiple steps that took precious time. A medic had to unwrap the dressing from its paper package, position the pad correctly over the wound, wrap the bandage around the limb multiple times, and secure it tightly. Even an experienced medic needed 30 to 45 seconds to apply a field dressing correctly. For a soldier bleeding from a severed femoral artery, that was too long. Shafrath had watched men die while he was still wrapping the bandage. He had applied field dressings that were soaked through with blood before he finished tying them. He had done everything he had been trained to do, and it was not enough. The problem was not technique. The problem was the equipment itself. The first soldier Shafrath lost to arterial bleeding was Private First Class Daniel Ortiz on July 23, 1943, near Palermo in Sicily. Ortiz had been moving through an olive grove when a German machine gun opened fire from a concealed position. One round struck Ortiz in the upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. Shafrath reached him within 60 seconds. He applied a tourniquet above the wound to stop the bleeding temporarily, then began applying a field dressing. But the wound was too large and too deep. The gauze pad could not maintain pressure. Blood soaked through the dressing immediately. Shafrath applied a second dressing on top of the first, wrapping it as tightly as he could. Ortiz's pulse was rapid and weak. His skin was pale. He was going into shock. Shafrath called for stretcher bearers. They arrived 3 minutes later. Ortiz died before they could carry him 200 yards to the battalion aid station. He had bled to death in less than 5 minutes. Shafrath recorded the death in his notebook. Name, rank, wound location, time from injury to treatment, time from treatment to death. He wanted to understand why Ortiz had died so quickly. The tourniquet had stopped most of the bleeding, but tourniquets could not be applied to wounds in the torso, neck, or groin, and even when they could be applied, they caused tissue damage if left in place too long. Medics were trained to loosen tourniquets every 20 to 30 minutes to restore circulation. During those brief intervals, soldiers could bleed to death if the wound dressing underneath was not effective. The second soldier Shafrath lost was Corporal James Mitchell on August 9, 1943, during the advance toward Messina. Mitchell had been hit by shrapnel from a mortar round. A metal fragment had struck him in the lower abdomen, severing the external iliac artery. Shafrath reached him immediately. He applied a field dressing and compressed the wound with both hands while calling for help, but the bleeding would not stop. Blood poured through the gauze pad. Shafrath applied additional dressings, stacking them on top of each other, pressing down with all his weight. Mitchell was conscious and talking. He asked if he was going to be okay. Shafrath told him yes. Mitchell died 4 minutes later. Shafrath's hands were covered in blood. He had done everything he could. It was not enough. By September, Shafrath had lost 19 men to arterial bleeding. Some died quickly, in less than 3 minutes. Others lasted longer, 5 or 6 minutes. Long enough to be loaded onto stretchers, but not long enough to reach the aid station. Shafrath began to notice patterns. Soldiers with wounds to major arteries in the thighs, groin, upper arms, or neck almost always died. Wounds to smaller arteries could sometimes be controlled if the medic applied enough pressure and the dressing did not slip. But major arterial wounds were almost always fatal. The problem was physics. Blood in the femoral artery flowed at high pressure. When the artery was severed, blood spurted from the wound with each heartbeat. A soldier's heart pumped approximately 5 quarts of blood per minute at rest. Under stress, in combat, with adrenaline surging, the heart rate increased dramatically. The heart could pump 8 or 9 quarts per minute. When an artery was severed, a soldier could lose a quart of blood in less than 60 seconds. Losing 2 quarts caused severe shock. Losing 3 quarts was usually fatal. The standard field dressing could not create enough pressure to stop that kind of bleeding. The gauze pad was too soft. The muslin bandage stretched too much. And the entire system relied on external compression, which was difficult to maintain when the soldier was being moved, when other soldiers were treating additional wounds, or when the medic had to move on to the next casualty. Shafrath spoke with other medics in the battalion. They had all experienced the same problem. They had all watched men bleed to death despite receiving immediate treatment. Some medics carried extra dressings and applied multiple layers. Others used torn clothing or blankets to create additional padding. A few had experimented with improvised compression devices, tying sticks or metal rods over the dressing to increase pressure. Nothing worked reliably. Arterial wounds remained the leading cause of preventable death on the battlefield. The battalion surgeon, Captain Robert Henshaw, acknowledged the problem but had no solution. Henshaw was a skilled surgeon, experienced and competent. He had performed hundreds of operations in field hospitals in North Africa and Sicily. But once a soldier reached the aid station, the surgeon could clamp the artery, tie it off, and stop the bleeding surgically. The problem was getting soldiers to the aid station alive. That was the medic's responsibility, and the medics did not have the tools they needed. Henshaw told Shafrath something that stayed with him. "We can save almost anyone who reaches us alive. The problem is that too many men die in the first 5 minutes. If you can keep them alive long enough to get here, we can save them. But I cannot save a man who has already bled out. Shafrath understood. The battalion aid station was typically located 500 to 1,000 yards behind the front lines. Stretcher bearers needed 10 to 15 minutes to carry a wounded man from the point of injury to the aid station, sometimes longer if the terrain was difficult or enemy fire was heavy. A soldier with a severed femoral artery would be dead long before the stretcher bearers arrived. The only way to save that soldier was to stop the bleeding immediately, in the field, within the first minute. Shafrath began thinking about what kind of dressing could do that. It needed to compress the wound instantly. It needed to maintain that compression without constant manual pressure. It needed to be applied quickly, in less than 10 seconds. And it needed to be made from materials that were available in the field, because Shafrath knew the Army was not going to issue new equipment based on the suggestions of a private first class from Indiana. On October 14, 1943, near the Volturno River, Shafrath watched 4 men die in one morning. All 4 had arterial wounds. All 4 received immediate treatment. All 4 died anyway. That was the day Shafrath decided he was going to fix this problem himself. Regardless of regulations, regardless of consequences, he was going to build a better bandage. And he was going to do it with whatever materials he could find. Shafrath sat alone in a supply tent on the evening of October 23, 1943. The 45th Division was in a rest area near Alife, Italy, about 20 miles north of Naples. The battalion had been pulled off the line for 5 days of rest and resupply after 2 weeks of continuous combat. Most of the men were sleeping, writing letters home, or playing cards. Shafrath was thinking about bandages. He had been examining the standard field dressing for an hour, taking it apart, studying how it was constructed. The gauze pad was made of loosely woven cotton fibers. It was designed to absorb blood, not compress wounds. The muslin bandage was soft and pliable, which made it comfortable to wear, but also meant it stretched easily under tension. When Shafrath tied a field dressing around his own forearm as tightly as he could still slip 2 fingers underneath the bandage after 30 seconds. The pressure was not constant. The bandage was not rigid enough. Shafrath needed something that would not stretch, something that would maintain constant pressure, something that could be applied quickly and would not loosen over time. He started thinking about materials that were stiff, waterproof, and strong. Then he remembered waxed paper. The Army packaged rations in waxed paper to keep them dry. The paper was coated with a thin layer of paraffin wax, which made it waterproof and slightly stiff. Shafrath had seen hundreds of sheets of waxed paper discarded after meals. It was everywhere, and it had exactly the properties he needed. Waxed paper was stiff enough to resist compression, but flexible enough to conform to the shape of a limb. It was waterproof so blood would not soak through it, and it was smooth, which meant it would not absorb blood the way gauze did. If Shafrath could place a layer of waxed paper between the wound and the gauze pad, the paper would act as a rigid pressure plate. The paper would distribute force evenly across the wound, and because the paper was waterproof, it would prevent blood from soaking through the dressing and reducing compression. Shafrath tested the idea immediately. He took a sheet of waxed paper from a discarded ration package, folded it into a 4-inch square, and placed it on his forearm. Then he placed a gauze pad on top of the paper and wrapped a muslin bandage around his arm. He tied the bandage as tightly as he could. This time, he could not slip his fingers underneath. The pressure was constant and strong. The waxed paper acted like a splint, preventing the bandage from stretching. The compression was significantly greater than a standard field dressing. Shafrath pressed his thumb against the bandage, simulating the pressure of blood spurting from an artery. The waxed paper did not compress. The pressure remained constant. He unwrapped the bandage and looked at his forearm. There was a clear red mark where the paper had pressed against his skin. The compression had been strong enough to indent the skin. That was exactly what he needed. But waxed paper alone was not enough. Shafrath needed something to hold the paper in place during application. He needed a layer between the wound and the paper to prevent the paper from sticking to exposed tissue. And he needed a way to apply the entire system quickly, without fumbling with separate components in the middle of combat. He thought about the construction of the standard field dressing. The gauze pad was sewn to the middle of the muslin bandage. What if he could create a similar system, but with the waxed paper integrated into the dressing? He could place a layer of cloth against the wound, then the waxed paper, then the gauze pad, all held together with the muslin bandage. The medic would apply the entire assembly as a single unit. The cloth would protect the wound. The paper would create rigid compression. The gauze would absorb excess blood, and the bandage would hold everything in place. Shafrath needed to test the design. He needed to build a prototype and see if it actually worked. But he also knew that modifying Army medical equipment without authorization was probably illegal. Medics were required to use standard issue supplies. Deviating from established procedures could result in disciplinary action. If Shafrath's modification failed and a soldier died, he could face charges of negligence or even manslaughter. But Shafrath had already watched 37 men die using standard equipment and standard procedures. He had followed the rules exactly. The rules had not saved them. If there was even a chance that his modification could save lives, he had to try. He would build the prototype, test it, and if it worked, he would use it in combat. He would deal with the consequences later. Shafrath gathered materials. He took several field dressings from the battalion medical supplies. He collected sheets of waxed paper from discarded ration packages. He found a sewing kit in his personal gear. He had learned basic sewing as a child, helping his mother repair clothes during the Depression. He could sew well enough to attach the paper to the dressing. The modification was simple. Shafrath unfolded a standard field dressing and laid it flat. He placed a 4-inch square of waxed paper directly on top of the gauze pad. Then he placed a second layer of gauze over the paper. He used needle and thread to sew the layers together, stitching around the edges to hold the paper in place. The entire assembly was now a single unit. When a medic applied the dressing, the first layer of gauze would contact the wound. The waxed paper would create rigid compression, and the outer gauze layer would absorb blood. Shafrath built 5 prototypes. Each one took approximately 20 minutes to construct. He tested them on his own arms and legs, wrapping them tightly and checking the compression. The waxed paper layer worked exactly as he had hoped. The pressure was constant and strong. The dressing did not stretch or loosen. The waterproof paper prevented blood simulation fluid from soaking through. The modification added almost no weight to the dressing. The waxed paper weighed less than an ounce. The additional gauze layer added another ounce. The total weight increase was negligible, and the cost was minimal. A sheet of waxed paper from a ration package cost the Army approximately 3 cents. A small piece of gauze cost another 2 cents. The thread was essentially free. The entire modification cost less than 50 cents per dressing. Shafrath packaged the 5 prototype dressings in his medical bag. He did not tell anyone what he had done. He would wait for the next casualty with an arterial wound. He would apply his modified dressing, and he would see if it saved a life. If it did, he would make more. If it did not, he would go back to standard dressings and accept that some problems could not be solved. But Shafrath believed it would work. He had thought through the physics. He had tested the materials. He had built something that addressed the specific failure points of the standard dressing. Now he just needed to find out if theory matched reality. He needed a combat test. And he would not have to wait long. The 45th Division returned to the front line on October 29, 1943. The division was assigned to attack German positions along the Volturno River north of Naples. The Germans had established strong defensive lines on high ground overlooking the river valley. American infantry would have to cross open terrain under direct fire from machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Casualties were expected to be heavy. Shafrath carried his 5 modified dressings in his medical bag, packed separately from the standard issue supplies. He had not told anyone about the modifications. He had not asked permission. He had simply built them and brought them to the field. If questioned, he would claim he had added extra padding for severe wounds. That was technically true. It just was not the whole truth. The attack began at 0600 on November 1st, 1943. The morning was cold and wet. Rain had fallen overnight, turning the ground to mud. Visibility was poor. Fog hung in the valley. American artillery fired a preparatory barrage for 30 minutes. Then the infantry advanced. Shafrath moved forward with Baker Company, 2nd Battalion. He stayed close to the lead platoon, but behind the assault squads. His job was to reach wounded men as quickly as possible, stabilize them, and mark their positions for stretcher bearers. He carried his medical bag, a canteen, and a pistol he had never fired. He wore a helmet with a red cross painted on white background. The Geneva Conventions were supposed to protect medics from being targeted deliberately. But Shafrath had learned in North Africa that some German soldiers respected that protection and some did not. He tried not to think about it. The lead platoon advanced 200 yards before encountering resistance. German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions on the hillside. The distinctive sound of MG-42s was unmistakable. Short, controlled bursts. Very accurate. Very lethal. American soldiers dove for cover behind rocks, in ditches, anywhere that offered protection. Some men did not make it. The machine gun fire was too fast. Shafrath heard someone scream for a medic. He ran forward, keeping low, moving in a crouch. He found Private First Class Anthony Russo lying in a shallow depression 20 yards from the German position. Russo had been hit in the upper thigh. Blood soaked his trousers. A lot of blood. Shafrath knew immediately it was an arterial wound. He crawled to Russo's position. Bullets snapped overhead. Shafrath ignored them. He focused on the wound. He tore open Russo's trouser leg with his shears. Blood pulsed from a small hole on the inner thigh. Femoral artery. Shafrath had seen this exact wound a dozen times. He knew what happened next. Russo would be dead in 3 minutes, unless the modified dressing worked. Shafrath pulled one of his prototypes from his medical bag. He tore open the paper wrapper. The dressing unfolded in his hands. He placed the first gauze layer directly against the wound. Then he wrapped the muslin bandage around Russo's thigh, pulling it as tight as he could. The waxed paper layer pressed against the wound site. Shafrath could feel the resistance. The paper was not compressing, it was holding firm. He wrapped the bandage twice more around the thigh and tied it off with a square knot. The entire application took 8 seconds. Shafrath placed his hand over the dressing and pressed down. No blood seeped through. He pressed harder. Still no blood. He checked Russo's pulse. It was fast but strong. Russo was conscious, talking, asking what was happening. Shafrath told him he was going to be fine. For the first time in 11 months, Shafrath actually believed that was true. Shafrath called for stretcher bearers. They arrived 4 minutes later. They loaded Russo onto a stretcher and carried him toward the battalion aid station. Shafrath stayed with the advance. He had 4 more modified dressings. He was going to need all of them. 20 minutes later, Shafrath treated Corporal Michael Torres. Torres had been hit by shrapnel from a mortar round. A fragment had struck him in the upper arm, severing the brachial artery. Blood sprayed from the wound with each heartbeat. Standard field dressing would have been soaked through in seconds. Shafrath applied his second modified dressing. Compression was immediate. Bleeding stopped within 10 seconds. Torres remained conscious. Stretcher bearers evacuated him. He survived. 40 minutes after that, Shafrath treated Private First Class William Kowalski. Kowalski had been hit in the neck by a rifle round that had fragmented on impact with his helmet. A metal shard had nicked the carotid artery. This was the worst kind of wound, nearly impossible to treat in the field. Tourniquets could not be applied to the neck. Standard dressings did not provide enough compression. Shafrath applied his third modified dressing, wrapping it around Kowalski's neck and over his shoulder. The waxed paper layer compressed the artery against the spine. Bleeding slowed dramatically. Kowalski remained conscious long enough to be evacuated. He survived. By noon, Shafrath had used all 5 modified dressings. All 5 soldiers survived long enough to reach the battalion aid station. Captain Henshaw performed surgery on 3 of them. All 3 lived. The other 2 had wounds that did not require surgery. Henshaw cleaned and sutured them in the aid station. Both returned to duty within 6 weeks. 5 arterial wounds treated. 5 soldiers saved. 100% survival rate. Shafrath had never seen anything like it. In 11 months of combat, he had never saved a single soldier with a severed major artery using standard dressings. With his modified dressings, he had saved 5 in 1 morning. That evening, Captain Henshaw called Shafrath to the aid station. Henshaw wanted to know what Shafrath had done differently. The survival rate for arterial wounds was normally less than 10%. Shafrath's casualties that day had all survived. That was statistically impossible unless something had changed. Shafrath explained the modification. He showed Henshaw one of the used dressings. Henshaw examined it carefully. He saw the waxed paper layer, now stained with blood. He saw how the paper had maintained its rigidity even under pressure. He understood immediately how it worked. Henshaw asked one question. "Did you get authorization for this?" Shafrath said no. Henshaw was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Shafrath would remember for the rest of his life. "I do not care about authorization. I care about results. 5 men are alive tonight because of what you did. That is all that matters. I want you to make more of these dressings. I want every medic in the battalion to carry them, and I want you to show them how to apply them correctly." Henshaw told Shafrath that he would handle any questions from higher command. If anyone asked about the modified dressings, Henshaw would take responsibility. He would claim he had authorized the modification as a medical officer. That was technically within his authority. Field surgeons had discretion to adapt medical procedures based on battlefield conditions. Henshaw would use that discretion to protect Shafrath. Shafrath went back to his tent that night and started making more dressings. He worked by flashlight. He had collected dozens of sheets of waxed paper from discarded ration packages. He had requisitioned additional gauze and muslin bandages from battalion supplies. He had everything he needed to produce modified dressings in quantity. He worked for 3 hours, until midnight. He completed 22 modified dressings. His fingers were sore from sewing. His eyes burned from working in dim light, but he had created enough dressings to supply every medic in the battalion. Tomorrow, he would distribute them and demonstrate the application technique. And if the other medics achieved the same results he had, word would spread. Other battalions would adopt the modification. Other divisions would hear about it. And soldiers who would have died from arterial wounds would survive. Shafrath knew he had built something important. He also knew that building it had required breaking rules, ignoring regulations, and taking risks that could have ended his career. But the rules had been written by people who had never watched a man bleed to death in 3 minutes. The regulations had been created by committees who had never applied a field dressing under fire. Shafrath had done what was necessary. He had solved a problem that was killing soldiers, and he had done it with 50 cents worth of materials and 4 hours of work. That was how wars were won. Not by following procedures, by fixing the procedures that did not work. The attack on German positions north of the Volturno River continued for 6 days. The 45th Division advanced slowly against fierce resistance. German forces defended every ridge, every hill, every river crossing. American casualties were heavy, but for the medics carrying Shafrath's modified dressings, something had changed. Soldiers with arterial wounds were surviving. Private First Class Donald Chen was the 6th soldier Shafrath treated with the modified dressing. Chen had been advancing with Charlie Company on November 2nd, when a German sniper shot him through the thigh. The bullet severed the femoral artery completely. Blood jetted from the wound. Chen collapsed. He screamed for a medic. Shafrath reached him in less than 30 seconds. He applied a modified dressing immediately. The waxed paper layer created instant compression. Blood flow stopped within 7 seconds. Chen's pulse was rapid but steady. His skin was pale but warm. He was conscious and responsive. Stretcher bearers evacuated him 10 minutes later. Captain Henshaw performed surgery that afternoon. Chen survived. He returned to duty in March 1944. 2 hours later, Corporal James Murphy was hit by shrapnel from an artillery shell. A metal fragment severed the brachial artery in his right arm. Corporal Thomas Brennan, a medic from Dog Company, reached Murphy first. Brennan had received one of Shafrath's modified dressings that morning. Shafrath had shown him how to apply it. Brennan had practiced on his own arm. Now he applied it in combat for the first time. Brennan placed the dressing over Murphy's wound and wrapped the bandage tightly. The bleeding stopped immediately. Murphy remained conscious. Brennan called for stretcher bearers. Murphy reached the aid station 20 minutes later. He survived. Brennan told Shafrath later that he had never seen a dressing work that fast. Standard field dressings took continuous manual pressure to slow arterial bleeding. Shafrath's modification stopped it completely in seconds. By November 4th, every medic in the 2nd Battalion was carrying modified dressings. Shafrath had produced 68 of them. Other medics helped with production. Word spread to adjacent battalions. Medics from the 1st and 3rd Battalions asked for modified dressings. Shafrath could not produce enough to meet demand. He taught other medics how to make them. Within a week, medics throughout the 45th Division were building their own modified dressings. The results were dramatic. In the 6 days of fighting from November 1st through November 6th, medics in the 2nd Battalion treated 23 soldiers with arterial wounds. 19 survived. That was an 83% survival rate. Before Shafrath's modification, the survival rate for similar wounds had been less than 10%. The difference was undeniable. Captain Henshaw reported the results to the division medical officer, Colonel Edmund Travis. Travis was skeptical. An 83% survival rate for arterial wounds was unheard of. Travis wanted to see the modified dressings himself. He wanted to understand how they worked, and he wanted to determine whether the modification was safe and effective enough to be adopted division-wide. Travis visited the 2nd Battalion Aid Station on November 8th. Shafrath demonstrated the application technique on a training mannequin. He explained the physics of compression, the waterproof properties of waxed paper, and the speed of application. Travis examined several used dressings. He saw how the waxed paper had maintained rigidity under pressure. He spoke with medics who had used the dressings in combat. All reported the same results: faster application, better compression, higher survival rates. Travis authorized immediate adoption of the modified dressing throughout the 45th Division. He also did something unusual. He wrote a formal report describing the modification and its results. He sent copies to 5th Army headquarters in Naples and to the Surgeon General's office in Washington. Travis recommended that the modified dressing be considered for Army-wide adoption. He included testimony from medics, survival statistics, and Shafrath's original prototype. The report reached 5th Army headquarters on November 15th. The 5th Army medical staff reviewed it immediately. They were facing the same problem throughout the Italian theater. Arterial wounds were killing soldiers faster than any other type of injury. Standard field dressings were inadequate. If a simple modification could increase survival rates from 10% to 83%, the Army needed to know about it. 5th Army ordered field tests of the modified dressing in 3 additional divisions. Medical officers were instructed to compare outcomes between soldiers treated with standard dressings and soldiers treated with modified dressings. The tests would run for 30 days. If the results matched what the 45th Division had reported, the modification would be recommended for theater-wide adoption. The field tests began on November 20th. The 3rd, 34th, and 45th Infantry Divisions all conducted combat operations during this period. Medics in designated battalions were issued modified dressings. Medics in control battalions continued using standard dressings. Both groups recorded detailed information on every arterial wound treated, including wound location, time from injury to treatment, time from treatment to evacuation, and final outcome. The results were consistent across all 3 divisions. Soldiers treated with modified dressings had survival rates between 78 and 86%. Soldiers treated with standard dressings had survival rates between 8 and 12%. The difference was statistically significant. The modified dressing worked. On December 18, 1943, 5th Army issued a directive authorizing the use of modified field dressings throughout all units in Italy. The directive did not require modification of existing supplies. Instead, it authorized medics to modify their own dressings using locally available materials. The directive included detailed instructions on how to construct the modification, based on Shafrath's original design. Medical supply officers were instructed to ensure medics had access to waxed paper and additional gauze. By January 1944, thousands of medics in Italy were using modified dressings. By February, the modification had spread to units in England preparing for the Normandy invasion. By March, reports of the modification had reached medical officers in the Pacific Theater, and by April, the Surgeon General's office in Washington had begun formal evaluation of the modification for potential inclusion in the standard Army medical kit. Shafrath continued treating wounded soldiers with his modified dressings through the winter and spring of 1944. He kept his notebook, recording every arterial wound he treated. By May, he had treated 71 soldiers with arterial wounds. 64 had survived. That was a 90% survival rate. Before his modification, Shafrath had treated 63 soldiers with similar wounds. Only 4 had survived. The difference was staggering. Other medics reported similar results. Corporal Thomas Brennan treated 42 arterial wounds with modified dressings between November 1943 and March 1944. 38 soldiers survived. Private First Class Robert O'Neill treated 36 arterial wounds. 33 survived. Sergeant Michael Romano treated 51 arterial wounds. 46 survived. The modification worked consistently, reliably, across multiple units and multiple theaters of operation. But Shafrath never stopped thinking about the men who did not survive. He had saved 64 soldiers, but 7 had still died. Some wounds were simply too severe. Some soldiers had lost too much blood before treatment. Some had multiple injuries that overwhelmed even the best medical care. Shafrath understood that his modification could not save everyone, but it could save most, and most was better than almost none. On the morning of April 23, 1944, Shafrath treated his last arterial wound in Italy. Private First Class Raymond Kowalski had been hit by machine gun fire during an attack on German positions near Monte Cassino. The bullet severed Kowalski's femoral artery. Shafrath reached him within 40 seconds. He applied a modified dressing. The bleeding stopped in 6 seconds. Kowalski remained conscious. He was evacuated. Captain Henshaw performed surgery. Kowalski survived. He returned home to Pennsylvania in November 1944. 3 days later, the 45th Division was pulled off the line for rest and retraining. Shafrath had been in combat for 10 months. He had treated more than 300 wounded soldiers. He had watched 63 men die from arterial bleeding before he developed his modification. He had watched 7 men die after. But he had saved 71 men who should have died. 71 soldiers went home to their families because of a 50-cent modification that a 22-year-old pharmacy assistant from Indiana had built in a supply tent with needle, thread, and waxed paper. In May 1944, the Surgeon General's office in Washington completed its evaluation of Shafrath's modified field dressing. The evaluation committee included senior medical officers, field surgeons with combat experience, and research physicians from Walter Reed Army Medical Center. They reviewed survival statistics from Italy, interviewed medics who had used the modification, and conducted laboratory tests to measure compression rates and durability. The committee's report was unequivocal. The modified dressing was superior to the standard field dressing in every measurable way. It provided faster application, greater compression, better hemorrhage control, and significantly higher survival rates. The committee recommended immediate adoption of the modification throughout the Army. But implementation faced obstacles. The Army medical supply system was enormous. Millions of field dressings were already in inventory. Factories were producing thousands more every day. Modifying every existing dressing would require tremendous effort and expense. Manufacturing new dressings with the waxed paper layer already integrated would require retooling factories, rewriting specifications, and updating supply contracts. The Surgeon General, Major General Norman Kirk, made a practical decision. The Army would not immediately replace all existing field dressings. Instead, medical supply officers would issue supplemental materials to frontline units. Every medic would receive sheets of waxed paper, additional gauze, and instructions for constructing modified dressings in the field. Medics could modify their existing supplies as needed. New dressings, manufactured after June 1944, would include the waxed paper layer as standard equipment. This compromise allowed rapid deployment of the modification without disrupting the supply chain. By June, units preparing for the Normandy invasion had access to modified dressings, or the materials to create them. By July, units in the Pacific had received similar supplies. By August, modified dressings were standard equipment throughout the European and Pacific theaters. The impact was immediate and measurable. In the first 3 months after D-Day, June through August 1944, medics in Europe treated approximately 8,000 soldiers with arterial wounds. 6,100 survived. That was a 76% survival rate. Historical data from similar operations in North Africa and Italy, before the modified dressing was available, showed survival rates of 8 to 12%. The difference represented approximately 5,000 additional survivors. 5,000 soldiers who went home because of Shafrath's modification. In September 1944, Private First Class John Shafrath was promoted to Technician 4th grade, equivalent to Sergeant. He received a Bronze Star for meritorious service. The citation mentioned his development of improved medical techniques that had saved numerous lives. It did not mention the specific modification. It did not mention the waxed paper. It did not mention that Shafrath had broken regulations by modifying Army equipment without authorization. Captain Robert Henshaw, who had protected Shafrath and authorized use of the modified dressing within the battalion, received a Legion of Merit. Colonel Edmund Travis, who had reported the modification to higher command, received a Commendation Medal. Both men credited Shafrath in their official statements. Both insisted that Shafrath deserved primary recognition for the innovation. But the Army did not publicize Shafrath's name widely. The official history of Army medical innovations in World War II mentions improved hemorrhage control techniques developed in 1943. It does not mention Shafrath. The Surgeon General's annual report for 1944 discusses advances in field trauma care. It does not mention Shafrath. The Army Medical Department's technical bulletins from 1944 include instructions for constructing modified field dressings. They do not mention who invented the modification. Shafrath did not care about recognition. He cared about results. And the results were clear. Modified field dressings were saving thousands of lives. That was enough. Shafrath remained with the 45th Division through the end of the war. He participated in the invasion of southern France in August 1944. He fought through the Vosges Mountains in the fall. He entered Germany in March 1945. He treated wounded soldiers in every campaign. He used his modified dressing dozens more times. He saved dozens more lives. By the time the war ended in May 1945, medics throughout the Army had treated an estimated 35,000 arterial wounds with modified dressings. Approximately 27,000 soldiers survived. Before the modification was available, the expected survival rate would have been 3,000 to 4,000. The difference was approximately 23,000 additional survivors. 23,000 men who lived because a pharmacy assistant from Indiana had figured out that waxed paper could stop arterial bleeding. Shafrath was discharged from the Army in November 1945. He returned to Terre Haute, Indiana. He went back to work as a pharmacy assistant. He married his girlfriend, Helen Kowalski, in December 1945. They had 3 children. Shafrath never spoke about the war except to other veterans. He never told his children about the modified field dressing. He never told them how many lives he had saved. In 1951, the Army Medical Department formally adopted the modified field dressing as standard equipment. The new dressing included an integrated waxed paper layer, exactly as Shafrath had designed it in 1943. The Army called it the Field Dressing Improved M1951. It remained standard issue for the next 20 years. Medics used it in Korea. Medics used it in Vietnam. Medics saved thousands of additional lives with it. None of the official documentation mentioned John Shafrath. In 1968, a military historian named Captain James Morrison was researching the development of battlefield medicine for a book on World War II medical innovations. Morrison discovered references to improved hemorrhage control techniques developed in Italy in 1943. He found Colonel Travis's report from November 1943, describing the modified dressing. He found survival statistics from the 45th Division, and he found Shafrath's name. Morrison tracked Shafrath down in Terre Haute. Shafrath was 56 years old, still working as a pharmacist. Morrison interviewed him for 6 hours. Shafrath described the problem, the solution, and the results. He showed Morrison his notebook from the war, still preserved after 25 years. The notebook contained names, dates, and outcomes for every soldier Shafrath had treated. Morrison realized he was looking at documentation of one of the most significant medical innovations of World War II. Morrison included a chapter on Shafrath in his book, published in 1971. The book received limited circulation. Most readers focused on chapters about surgical techniques and hospital organization. The chapter about a pharmacy assistant who saved thousands of lives with waxed paper received little attention. Shafrath died in 1986 at the age of 64 from a heart attack. His obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune mentioned his service as an Army medic in World War II. It mentioned his Bronze Star. It did not mention the modified field dressing. It did not mention the thousands of lives he had saved. At the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, an exhibit on battlefield trauma care includes a display of field dressings used throughout American military history. The exhibit shows dressings from the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. One display case contains an M1951 field dressing improved. The dressing is sealed in plastic, preserved exactly as it was manufactured 70 years ago. The placard describes the dressing's construction: gauze pad, waxed paper compression layer, muslin bandage. The placard mentions that this design significantly improved survival rates for arterial wounds. The placard does not mention John Shafrath. Most visitors walk past the display without stopping. Field dressings are not dramatic. They do not look impressive. They are small, simple, mundane. They do not command attention the way surgical instruments or evacuation helicopters do. But that small, simple, mundane object saved more lives than almost any other piece of medical equipment in World War II. And it was invented by a 22-year-old pharmacy assistant who had watched too many men bleed to death and decided he could do something about it. Shafrath's story is not unique. The history of military innovation is filled with similar examples. Ordinary soldiers solving problems that official doctrine did not address. Mechanics improving equipment that engineers said could not be improved. Frontline troops adapting tactics that staff officers said would not work. Wars are won by people who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. The modified field dressing represents something important about how innovation actually happens. It was not developed in a laboratory. It was not designed by a committee. It was not the result of a formal research program. It was built by a combat medic sitting in a supply tent, thinking about why soldiers were dying and figuring out a solution with materials that cost 50 cents. The innovation was not technological, it was conceptual. Shafroth understood that compression was more important than absorption. He understood that rigid materials worked better than soft materials. He understood that speed mattered more than complexity. And he had the skill and determination to turn that understanding into a practical solution. The Army medical establishment deserves credit for recognizing the value of Shafroth's innovation and adopting it quickly. Captain Henshaw protected Shafroth from potential disciplinary action. Colonel Travis reported the modification to higher command. Major General Kirk authorized rapid deployment. The system worked, but the system only worked because Shafroth had already solved the problem. He had not waited for authorization. He had not submitted a proposal through official channels. He had not asked permission. He had seen men dying and built something to save them. That kind of initiative is difficult to cultivate in military organizations. Militaries depend on discipline, hierarchy, and standardization. Soldiers are trained to follow orders, execute established procedures, and trust that the system will provide what they need. That approach works most of the time, but sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the equipment does not work. Sometimes the doctrine is wrong, and in those moments, militaries need soldiers like Shafroth, who will break the rules to fix what is broken. The challenge for military institutions is creating space for that kind of innovation without undermining discipline and cohesion. The Army faced that challenge with Shafroth's modification. Officially, Shafroth had violated regulations by modifying medical equipment without authorization. He had risked soldiers' lives by using unproven techniques in combat. He had acted outside the chain of command. Any of those actions could have justified disciplinary action. But the Army recognized that Shafroth had saved lives. He had solved a problem that killed thousands of soldiers. He had done it quickly, cheaply, and effectively. The Army chose to reward innovation rather than punish deviation from procedure. That choice mattered. If the Army had court-martialed Shafroth for unauthorized equipment modification, other soldiers would have learned to never take similar risks. Problems that could have been solved would have remained unsolved. Soldiers who could have been saved would have died. The Army's willingness to protect and promote Shafroth sent a message that innovation was valued more than strict adherence to regulations. That message encouraged other soldiers to think creatively about battlefield problems. The modified field dressing saved an estimated 27,000 lives in World War II. That number is difficult to comprehend. 27,000 men who lived instead of dying. 27,000 families who were not destroyed by loss. 27,000 futures that continued instead of ending on a battlefield in Italy or France or Germany or the Pacific. And that number only includes World War II. The M1951 field dressing, based on Shafroth's design, remained in use through Korea and Vietnam. Thousands more soldiers survived arterial wounds because of the same modification. The total number of lives saved is probably over 40,000. 40,000 lives saved by waxed paper and thread. Shafroth never knew the full impact of what he had done. He knew he had saved soldiers in his own battalion. He knew his modification had been adopted by other units, but he never knew the final count. He never knew that 40,000 men went home because of his idea. He never received the recognition he deserved. His name does not appear in most histories of World War II. His contribution is rarely mentioned in discussions of battlefield medicine. There are no monuments to John Shafroth, no buildings named after him. no medals awarded posthumously. But 40,000 men lived. That is the legacy that matters. At the Army Medical Department Museum at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, a small display in the basement archives contains original documents from World War II medical innovations. Buried among hundreds of reports and technical bulletins is Colonel Travis's report from November 1943, describing the modified field dressing. The report includes survival statistics, testimony from medics, and a hand-drawn diagram showing how to construct the modification. In the corner of the diagram, someone wrote in pencil, "Designed by T/4 Shafrath, 45th Inf. Div." That pencil notation is the only place in any official Army archive where Shafrath is credited by name for the modification that saved 40,000 lives. The notation is fading. The paper is yellowing. In another 20 years, the ink may be illegible. Eventually, even that small acknowledgement will disappear. But the idea will survive. The concept that compression stops bleeding faster than absorption. The understanding that simple solutions sometimes work better than complex ones. The recognition that ordinary soldiers can solve extraordinary problems. Those ideas are Shafrath's real legacy. They are embedded in modern battlefield medicine. They are taught to every combat medic. They save lives every day. That is how wars are won. Not by generals or politicians or advanced technology. By pharmacy assistants who figure out that waxed paper stops arterial bleeding. By mechanics who improve equipment with spare parts. By soldiers who see problems and fix them. The heroes of war are rarely famous. Their names do not appear in history books. But their innovations save thousands of lives. And their legacy endures long after their names are forgotten. John William Shafrath died in 1986. He was buried in Highland Lawn Cemetery in Terre Haute, Indiana. His grave marker mentions his service in the 45th Infantry Division. It mentions his Bronze Star. It does not mention the modified field dressing. Visitors to the cemetery walk past his grave without stopping. They do not know that the man buried there saved 40,000 lives. They do not know that he changed battlefield medicine forever. They do not know that he was one of the most important medical innovators of the 20th century. But the soldiers who survived because of him knew. The medics who used his modification knew. The families who welcomed their sons and brothers and fathers home knew. They knew that somewhere in Italy, in 1943, a young medic had refused to accept that arterial wounds meant death. They knew that he had built something better with materials that cost 50 cents. They knew that his innovation had made the difference between living and dying. That knowledge is enough. That is the legacy. 40,000 lives saved by waxed paper, thread, and the determination of one soldier who believed he could solve a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. That is how ordinary people change history. That is how wars are won.